The death toll from Colombia's catastrophic 7.4 magnitude earthquake has climbed to at least 265 people, with a further 496 still listed as missing, according to figures released by President Abelardo de la Espriella late Wednesday. That number has more than doubled in less than 48 hours, and officials on the ground continue to warn that it does not yet reflect the full scale of what happened in the mountains of western Colombia on Monday morning. Nearly 3,800 people have been injured. More than 9,550 homes have been destroyed outright. Over 30,000 families have been displaced, damaged out of their houses, or cut off from basic services entirely. 5 capital cities remain under red alert, the highest disaster classification the Colombian state can issue. And in several of them, local mayors have imposed nightly curfews, citing the risk of looting in neighborhoods where entire blocks now stand empty and unsecured. The earthquake struck at 7:34 in the morning local time on Monday, the 10th of August. Its epicenter sat roughly 5 kilometers east of San José del Palmar, a small town of fewer than 5,000 people in the mountainous Chocó department, about 400 kilometers west of the capital, Bogotá. The United States Geological Survey placed the rupture at a depth of just over 100 kilometers. Colombia's own geological service put it at around 103 kilometers and confirmed the magnitude at 7.4, describing it as the largest seismic event recorded in the country this century. That depth matters. A rupture that far below the surface spreads its energy across an enormous area rather than concentrating it in one narrow zone. It is the reason the shaking was felt in Bogotá, in Medellín, across the border in Ecuador, in Panama, and in parts of Venezuela. And it is also the reason the destruction did not stay confined to the region nearest the epicenter. The worst of the damage landed more than 50 kilometers away, in cities that had no reason to expect it. The single hardest hit city is Cali, Colombia's third largest, home to roughly 2 million people. 56 buildings came down there. At least 95 people were killed and close to 1,000 injured, according to data compiled by Capitales, the National Association of Capital Cities. Witnesses described clouds of dust rising over the skyline as structures collapsed one after another in the minutes after the shaking stopped. In Pereira, the capital of Risaralda department and the heart of Colombia's coffee-growing region, at least 79 people have been confirmed dead. The mayor's office reports around 300 residents still unaccounted for. Pereira sits some 55 kilometers from the epicenter. Electricity was almost entirely lost across the city, and on the first night, residents navigated blacked-out streets by torchlight, while volunteers dug through the remains of collapsed apartment blocks by hand. Many people slept outside rather than return to buildings they no longer trusted. Indira Meneses, a 49-year-old nurse living in Pereira with her 2 children and her elderly mother, described the front of her home collapsing and trapping the family inside. Neighbors pulled them out. 5 other people on her street did not survive. Days later, she said, no official help had reached them at all. Rescue teams spent Thursday racing against a deadline that every seismologist and disaster responder in the world recognizes. The first 72 hours after a major earthquake are the window in which survivors buried under rubble have a realistic chance of being found alive. Cali's mayor, Alejandro Eder, told reporters that less than a day of that window remained. Teams would keep working past it, he said, but the odds change sharply once it closes. The mechanics of that search are brutal and slow. In Cali, efforts concentrated on 7 specific buildings believed to still hold survivors. At the Torres de Limonar complex in the south of the city, residents formed human chains alongside soldiers and municipal workers, passing buckets of debris hand to hand down from the top of the pile. A fire department official from Bogotá explained that operations became measurably more effective once police began restricting the number of volunteers on site. Fewer people meant less noise and less vibration, which meant acoustic sensors could actually pick up movement underneath the concrete. That same official noted a danger the crowds themselves created. Colombia's Geological Service has now recorded more than 70 aftershocks since Monday. Any one of them could bring down a partially collapsed structure onto the people standing on it. Families of those still trapped waited at the perimeter regardless, refusing to leave. 30 kilometers northeast of Cali, in Palmira, Relatives of the dead sat on plastic chairs in the shade outside a morgue, while an official read out the names of identified bodies over a loudspeaker. Santiago Lloreda, 31, was at work when the quake destroyed his apartment, killing his mother and his 13-month-old daughter. The child was too young to have a fingerprint on file. Her identification requires DNA samples processed in Bogotá. The disaster has become the defining early crisis of a government that is barely a week old. President de la Espriella was inaugurated on Friday the 7th of August, 3 days before the earthquake, after a narrow election victory built on a platform of reduced public spending and tougher security policy. He traveled to the affected regions early in the week and has pledged financial support to families who lost homes and businesses. Analysts have pointed out the uncomfortable position this puts him in. Tiziano Breda, a Latin America specialist at the conflict monitoring organization ACLED, noted that the incoming administration had campaigned on cutting public finances, including defunding the state's disaster risk management unit, the same unit now leading the emergency response. The new government is simultaneously preparing to revise a budget of more than $180 billion inherited from its predecessors. Colombia's foreign minister, Omar Bula, has publicly rejected reports that the government turned down offers of international assistance, saying his office is coordinating shipments that have already begun arriving from Peru, Mexico, and El Salvador. Governments across the United States, South America, Europe, and the Middle East have offered support. A Mexican search and rescue team, Topos Azteca, arrived in Colombia directly from Venezuela, where twin earthquakes at the end of June killed more than 6,000 people. A disaster still fresh enough that many Colombians described watching their own buildings fall with that footage in mind. There is an economic dimension that will outlast the rescue phase. Colombia is the world's third largest coffee producer, and the earthquake struck directly through the Eje Cafetero, the coffee axis, a UNESCO-recognized region of steep green valleys where hundreds of thousands of families depend on the crop. The head of the National Coffee Federation, Germán Bajamón, said ports at Buenaventura have paused operations while inspectors assess landslide damage to critical access roads, though exports are continuing largely through Caribbean ports instead. Assessment teams are still working through rural farms and infrastructure that many roads no longer reach. The governor of Valle del Cauca reported that close to 80% of the town of El Cairo has been affected. In Chocó, the department containing the epicenter, damage assessment has been slowed by communications outages that left some areas without mobile service for many hours. Much of Chocó is dense jungle reachable only by boat or aircraft. It is one of the poorest regions in the country, and officials have been consistently clear that the numbers coming out of it are incomplete. 7 airports suspended operations in the immediate aftermath, including those serving Pereira, Manizales, Quibdó, Armenia, Cartago, and Buenaventura, a significant constraint on moving aid and personnel into precisely the areas that needed them most. Roads, hospitals, aqueducts, power systems, and telecommunications networks all sustained damage across the hardest hit zones. In Cali, a hospital suffered a partial collapse, forcing staff to relocate patients while still treating earthquake casualties. In Manizales, video captured the tower of the historic cathedral coming down. For the coffee region, the parallel is impossible to ignore. In 1999, a 6.1 magnitude earthquake near the city of Armenia killed roughly 1,100 people and left an estimated 250,000 homeless. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern Colombian history, and it happened to the same communities now digging through rubble again. Residents in Armenia have described the damage this week as bringing that year back in full. Colombia sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped belt of fault lines encircling the Pacific Ocean, where the majority of the world's earthquakes and volcanic eruptions occur. Small tremors are routine in central and western Colombia. Events above magnitude 6.0 are rare. An event of this size, at this depth, under this many population centers, has no modern precedent in the country. As of the latest reports, search and recovery operations continue around the clock in Cali, Pereira, Manizales, and Quibdó. Hospitals across the affected departments remain overwhelmed. Displaced families are sheltering in gymnasiums and school buildings. And the gap between the official missing figure of 496 and the figures being compiled independently by civilian volunteer databases, which have at points run into the thousands, remains the single largest unknown in this disaster. Officials have not ruled out further substantial increases to the death toll. The full human and economic cost of what happened on Monday morning will not be known for days, and in the most isolated